You're listening to Invest in the Future by Future Africa, a live fireside chat series where we learn from interesting people doing important work globally.
Awesome. Welcome, Matthew, and hello to everybody who's listening in to the podcast today. This is Investing in Africa's Future with Future Africa. Very excited to have Matt Grollnek on the line with us. He is an expert that focuses on the future of work, has a particular focus on Africa. And I think with just a lot of the conversation around the future of work generally, a lot of us in the VC startup ecosystem are talking about this, right, and have questions about this. So we thought it would be a really great conversation to have. Want to take just a moment to allow Matthew to introduce himself, and then we'll get right into it. All right, over to you, Matthew.
Yeah, great. No, I'm really happy to be here and just have this conversation. I'm just really passionate about thinking about the future, how technology is going to change that future, and then therefore, what do we need to be doing today in order to prepare for that in terms of education, but in terms of work, economy. So looking forward to diving into that.
Definitely. And I think with that being said, we can get right into it. So Visual Capitalist started off the year with several predictions, and we'll flash the link so people can have access to it. They talked and reviewed 700 different sources. Just given your focus area and your background, give us one prediction for 2024. What is something that we should be watching out for, something we should be paying attention to as it relates to the future of work?
Yeah, great. I might give you more than one. The first one is that, and this might seem elementary to some people, but I think that 2024 is the year of AI integration. Last year, we really saw just kind of this introduction of generative AI, and I think that was a shock for many people. And so we had to kind of come to terms with what that was, what does it mean? And I think this is the year that it really gets integrated into the tools that we use. Microsoft obviously has been doing that, but I think that across a wide range of tools that we're using, we're going to see that more and more just integrated natively into these tools. So that's number one. If you want me to give you a specifically like technical thing, we just saw the release of OpenAI release their text to video tool, and I think the next one that drops actually is text to 3D. And what I mean by that is, a lot of the things, video, images, these things that have been generated are not very editable, right? They come as like a JPEG, difficult to kind of edit, or a video, difficult to edit. We can imagine that it comes as a 3D model where you can now go in and start moving the points around, and it's a very editable type of thing. Or even just more vectorized types of images that you can go in and just kind of very easily manipulate. So that's kind of my first one, or 1.5. Yes. Okay. The other one I wanted to mention, although when I went out, this is actually a prediction I made back in January, but when I went on to the Visual Capitalist article, I saw that they also had this there, but I'll just repeat it anyway, which is I think that kind of on the other side of things, I think that this is the year that we see generative AI really take a big role, or maybe even a disruptive role in elections. We have tons of elections going across the world this year. I think there's a stat, it's like 1 out of every 4 people will participate in an election this year in the world. Yes. And so we're going to see all sorts of generative images purporting to show various people saying various things that may kind of be confusing to a lot of people. So I think that's kind of a scary thing. But I also think there's a silver lining to that, which is that it becomes a time where people become very aware of the capabilities of AI and can then start to lean in and participate a little bit more. So I think that's the silver lining, hopefully, to all this. Hopefully.
And I'm with you on it, given the number of elections, but even more broadly, the opportunity for deep fakes, the opportunity for people to use this in malicious ways. I mean, arguably any tech that has ever been developed ever, you could make that argument for, but the rate at which people will be able to make these kinds of deep fakes, the rate at which people will be able to, the scale and impact right? With how far these kinds of things can go, that is definitely, but I appreciate that you added a silver lining in there because I think we definitely need that. Maybe continuing on with that thread. So there were lots of predictions, but going back to the future of work, I think it can mean different things to different audiences and to different people. So can you just maybe contextualize the future of work? Especially, again, given the rate of change, the pace at which things are moving, there are lots of concerns around the future of work, and it usually gets kind of partnered together to mean jobs. But can you maybe just help us take a step back a little bit and help us contextualize the future of work in your mind?
Let's talk about even just almost defining the future of work. And I think, the way I think about it, there's kind of three components to it. There's the work, there's the worker, and there's the workplace. I think it's very easy for us, when you look at the media, there's kind of different things that pull our attention. AI is obviously one of them. Then there's kind of the whole debate around, should we be in the office, out of the office? And I think those are all part of the future of work conversation, but Definitely. It's kind of step back and say, look at it more holistically. I think those are kind of the three buckets. And I think of those in terms of the specific trends that are going on. There's kind of the work. So to me, that's like, where will the jobs be of the future? I don't mean specifically physically where will they be, but like what sectors will they be in? What countries will they be in? And I think that's, and so we have some general trends that have gone on and that will probably continue, and then some things that may disrupt those. That's number one. Number two is skills. So what skills do people need for those jobs of the future? And this is where, for me, the AI debate comes in, because there's a big question around what will computers and artificial intelligence be doing versus what will humans be doing. And I think sometimes we also think about that as, will this job be there or will it not be there? But oftentimes we need to go even to the task level. So which task will be done by AI and which task will be done by the human. So also, on the worker front, so that's kind of on the worker front. The other one is, what is our relationship to work? For a long time, it's kind of like you're an employee of a company. And I think for, more and more, we're seeing that kind of relationship changing a little bit, whether it's freelancing, consultancies, whether it's, part-time work. I think more and more you're seeing gig worker. I think more and more you're seeing people who have specialties, and they're now able to kind of apply that across a wider range of companies or organizations. So I think that's another big trend. And then the last one, is the location debate. So where are people? So this is the workplace. Where are people working from? And and with remote work or with hybrid work, this allows various types of things and people to move around. There's of course the big digital nomad movement, but beyond that, even if we don't go that extreme, what does this mean for cities that have big infrastructure and assumptions about how many people will be there versus suburban areas versus kind of more rural areas? So those are all some of the big questions, just generally around the future of work.
That makes sense, definitely, that framing. And I like how you broke it up into those three categories. Could you add a layer of how Africa, your point of view on how Africa fits into the future of work discussion?
Yeah, great. So, the first one I talked about was where are the jobs? What's the trend in jobs? I think, first of all, there's the broad trends. So interestingly, typically we've seen countries go on a path to development from agriculture to manufacturing into services. That's been the typical route that we've seen, especially when we look at Asia. And the interesting thing that we're seeing is that may not be the path that Africa is heading down. We've started to see, so you have a lot of people in agriculture.
Yep.
You started to see manufacturing going up. But in recent years, in many countries, we've started to see it going down kind of prematurely. Typically, you would think of it going up to like 30%, at least, population in manufacturing before it starts to decline, and then you get the spike in services.
Right.
We're starting to see countries already go down at 10%. But yet services are growing. So I think there's a question, will it just go directly to services? Is that a viable option? Does that mean, services are oftentimes higher paying. So does that mean that we'll get kind of more concentration of wealth than the other one? So that's part of it. But the other type thing in terms of where the jobs are is because of the types of jobs that we find more, which are oftentimes more informal. You have more people kind of in the, doing manual labor and these types of things. These are some of the jobs that are going to be less affected by tech trends like AI. So I think the optimistic point of view here is that we're going to see less disruption. If you kind of look at the overall aggregate, less disruption of jobs. And hopefully we're going to see a lot more opportunities. So there's with new jobs coming onto the scene, because we do know there will be new jobs created by new technology. Those are going to be, distributed around the world, and Africa potentially could have the opportunity to take some of those jobs. Definitely. So that's kind of like a big macro picture. I can continue with these other ones, please. If that's all right. Yeah. So on the skill side, I think that partly again, because of the types of jobs, we're not as disrupted perhaps as other areas of the world. But if we want to position Africa as a place that is able to take those new jobs that are being created, those are going to be higher skilled types of jobs. And I do think that we need to, I think this is an area that Africa does need to probably, Africa is obviously a big place with lots of different countries and models, but generally, all the things, generally as a trend, I think that education does need to get a little bit closer to industry and to the market and understand what, a little bit more of what's applied. So that would be an area that I think needs to do a little better on. Later on, I'm happy to dive deeper into the specific skills that we would think about. The next thing I would say is, platform work, freelancing. I think that's just a huge trend on the African continent in terms of, platforms that are able to, in the supply chain, things like Wasoko, as a company that are able to kind of, take what was actually usually quite informal and actually put a platform on, infrastructure around it, aggregate it. So I think that's a trend that we will continue to see. And then the last one, this is now going back to location. I actually do think that we are starting to see more people move. We're just seeing the beginnings of people starting to move away from some of the big cities. These kind of higher end workers in the services sector that are saying, listen, my family's home is upcountry, and I'm going to take some time to go up there and spend some time working from there, or so I'm in Nairobi. And we're seeing there's a town called Kilifi that's on the coast that has basically been booming since COVID, which is both expats and local Kenyans that are saying, listen, I don't need to be in Nairobi every day. I'm going to live from there because I want to be by the coast. And I think that's where the lifestyle is. So which I think is great, because I think that brings opportunities outside of kind of these big cities. And a lot of African countries are oftentimes built around these one big cities that are service the whole country. So I think it helps to bring opportunities and capital throughout the country, which I think could be a good.
To your point, right? I think you said a lot of really great context when you were describing the framework for how we think about the future of work, but underpinning that is really the state of education, right? So there's so much to consider when we think about the future of work, but if we don't have the fundamentals, if we don't have a basis in the education system with what skills are people learning, what jobs are going to be available when people come out, it's going to be hard to talk about the future of work and separating education, if you will. The secondary school experience is the last one that many Africans have before they enter the workforce. So the question is really around, as we think about the future of work, you have young people, they will go to primary school, they go to secondary school, and then they likely enter the workforce from there. And then some may go on to tertiary institutions. But in the context of the future of work, does this model still work, right? How do we disrupt the pattern to meet the pace of the technological change and advancement that's happening at such a rapid pace? So two-part question there.
Yeah. I think it's a great question. And to just emphasize the question with a few statistics. So generally, if you aggregate across the African continent, only about 30, so you lose about 30% of young people at the end of primary. So 30% of young people either drop out in primary or at the end of primary. Then you get to secondary, you lose another 30% while they're in secondary. Yeah. So they don't complete secondary. You lose another 30% at the end of secondary, so they complete, but they don't continue on to tertiary. And then only about 10% or 9% of young people will actually kind of make it to tertiary. So yeah, if you look at that, that means about 60% of young people are actually entering the workforce from secondary school. So yeah, it's, we need to, so yes, not everything is working as we would hope it would be. And oftentimes our education in our primary school is still kind of what it's trying to do is prepare people for the next level, but not everybody's getting to the next level. Right. So yeah, so we need to think about that. And the way I think about it is you can do it in one of two ways. One is you can improve the current system, or you can create a whole new system. And but I think there's a lot that can be done in the current system. So before we get onto these more radical ideas, there's other things we can do in terms of what we're teaching and how we approach it. First of all, it's just being realistic to say not everybody's going to go on to tertiary. So how do we prepare them for the world that they'll be going into? Yes. Another statistic, about 90% of young people work in the informal economy. So these are people who are working at markets, moving goods around the country. They might have a particular trade. But one of the things about the informal economy is that, oftentimes people wake up in the morning and they're not always, they have a lot of choices. Like I have a day job, so I don't have a lot of choices in terms of what I'm going to do for work today or tomorrow. Sure, I could quit my job and that would be something, but on a day-to-day basis, I kind of know what I'm doing. Right. People in the informal economy, not everybody, some people in the informal economy have a choice every day. Should I go look for this type of work? Should I go talk to a friend who might know what's going on? Should I stick with the vegetable stand that I've been doing, or should I have a new product on the shelf? And so I think one of the big things is around evaluating opportunities, and I think there's definitely an element there of financial education or financial literacy, but just, what are the opportunities that are available and how do I evaluate these? I think that's just a very critical skill that I don't think we fully get at in the education system. And being able to quickly kind of move on to something new, learn a new skill quickly and be able to adapt. So that would be one thing. There's many other things. I think we definitely need some more kind of counseling and career counseling at that level of education. I think that would be great. And of course, there's things we can do with pedagogy. How do we teach better? But I'll leave it there.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting. I was going to say it's an interesting point, and I think for people to just underscore the number of people that end up not actually completing their education, and so I think it even furthers the point about what are the models that we could be creating to help people with very tangible skills? Because the one, I think, assumption that you make in the last point, which was how do they have choice. They can make choices, about what they're going to do. Ultimately, it's driven by money, right? And how much money they can make by doing whatever job that they are able to get and whatever job they're able to do, that they have the skills to be able to do. But if we were able to narrow that gap, and I think that was your point, by helping people come into a space where there's some sort of evaluation or assessment on your capability, and then allowing people to go through some sort of skills training program that then brings them up to a level where they can now do this particular job, right? And they know that they can make X money as a result of it. So if we could close that gap where we know that the ultimate goal for many people not completing their education system or not completing their education is to get a job, to be able to make money, to be able to provide for their family. How do you help close that gap? We know you might not be able to finish school, but is there a way that we could help evaluate your capabilities, help you skill up in a particular area and get a job at the end of that, and just closing that cycle, as opposed to the thinking of, okay, I'm going to go out and hawk today because I've got some things that I could sell, and then tomorrow I might go down the street and go and work with a carpenter for a little bit. Like, how do we help narrow that gap, recognizing there's work to be done to help societies move, right, and to help economies grow? So I just wanted to underscore your point a little bit by talking about that, but you had a second point that you wanted to make there too.
Yeah, and just quickly to add on to that, you know, the things that I've seen that have worked well is when you're teaching a hard skill, kind of a, you know, a trade, let's say, and then really pairing that with the soft skills so that people can make those evaluations and you know, oftentimes they're driving their businesses and, you know, so where should I drive it? We also know that technology changes. And so there will be adaptations that will need to be made eventually in the types of work that they do, and how do they evaluate whether to make that change or when to make that change. So I think those are just important skills that, I mean, quite frankly, you know, these are difficult decisions for anyone.
Definitely.
So, Definitely. You know, it's a hard thing. It's a hard thing to do. Yeah. The second point is now the kind of more like, how do we reimagine a different type of system? Yes. And, you know, I might need to lay a little bit of groundwork to get to this point. For some people, this may be very apparent. For some people, this might be quite new. But you know, I could explain it a couple different ways. But if you think about education, and we were just to kind of say, okay, great. What do we want for education? Well, we want to train somebody to be ready to take part in the economy. We want to train somebody in order to take care of themselves. We want to train somebody so that they can interact with other people, be part of society, right? Build those interpersonal skills, right? And so great. Let's figure out how to do that. Good. Well, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to have a building. Yes. We're going to put it away from society. We're going to take it away from the economy, and we're going to put people in a room. Yes. And say, good, now this is where you're going to learn how to be part of the economy and part of the society. Okay. You're taking them away. You're taking them away. You're kind of isolating them. Right. And so, you know, I think there's some real opportunities here to say, maybe there's other ways to do this, where we are more integrated into the economies and societies that we are trying to prepare people for. Right. So that's number one. Number two, you know, we kind of, as a society, I would say, you know, that's both the kind of like the country system, you know, a country, most countries, you know, Africa, even the world as a whole. Yeah. We made a decision, which I fully agree with, which is that education for all is valuable. We want everybody to have access to education. That's, you know, I think we've even said that this is a human right. Everyone should have access to education. Right. But in doing that, there are trade-offs, because there are other forms of education where not everybody has access to it, but they would have access to more one-on-one, more individualized education. The trade-off that we made is to say, great, we're going to put a bunch of students together. There's not going to be one-on-one mentoring, or at least full-time one-on-one mentoring for everybody. Right. Because we just don't have the people and the capacity to do that. Right. So our current system, you know, you have a teacher. They're working with a class. They may or may not be able to know kind of the intricacies of each student. Many. I mean, this is not to take away from teachers. Teachers have a lot on their plate. They're doing a great job. Yeah, hard job. It's a hard job. But they're trying. You know, they're trying to get to know their students. But they physically cannot give one-on-one full-time mentorship to everyone. It's just can't do it. That's the trade-off that we made for saying everybody should have access to education. Well, so I think that, you know, if we were to kind of reimagine an education system, I think these would be two things that we would want to address. We get people more in the world and get people more one-on-one training. So the first thing is that, so let me spell that out a little.
Yeah.
First thing is that, to kind of bring people away from society for, let's say, 16 years, and then you have this entrance into society, maybe in, certain contexts that's earlier, maybe you don't get as much education. I could see something where we do a lot more of like cyclical type of learning. So people are, going into jobs, as they need to learn something, they kind of cycle back into education, and kind of cycle in and out of it. So that's number one. So they have times where they're in education, and then they're out, and then they're in, and then they're out. When they're out, this is number two. So when they're out of education, they're still learning. And we all know this, we're in our day-to-day jobs, and we learn on the job all the time.
Exactly.
But can we provide some support and some structure around that? So again, going to this idea, if I'm learning negotiation tactics, it's the best way to do that is probably not just sitting and reading about negotiation tactics in a book. It's to be in the market. And ideally, you can imagine if I had the world's best negotiator shadowing me as I go to the market, and I'm negotiating for some vegetables, and I eventually get those vegetables. And maybe the one-on-one expert has kind of prepared me in advance. Oh, here's some things you want to think about. Great, so I go in with that. I do my negotiation, and then I come out, and then afterwards they say, "Great, you did this really well. You did this really well. Here's something you may want to try. You could have done this differently." So that would be, that's kind of like education as we're in the world.
Yes.
And I can kind of see AI playing a really interesting role in doing this.
Definitely.
You can imagine if, you had your phone, and your phone was listening as this kind of all went on, prepared you in advance, and then was able to give you that individual feedback. And that's kind of how one of the ways that I see AI is it's an expert. It democratizes expertise.
Definitely.
Everybody now can have an expert with them at all times.
Exactly.
So that would be kind of the second idea is having education away from the classroom, as well as shuffling in and out of the classroom, but also in the world. So that's there's just kind of like some ideas I'll throw out there.
That's amazing. I mean, what it reminds me of, and I think about that, a couple of questions came to mind. One was, if we all reflect on the first 21 years of our lives, the amount of school, or even call it 18 years of our lives in school, and what skills were necessary for you to be a functioning adult in society versus what skills you learned that you still use today, right? The ratio. There are so many more skills that we should have learned about interpersonal communication, conflict resolution, managing yourself, financial planning and budgeting and all that we didn't learn, but we spent 21 years in school, 18 years in school, whatever it is. So the idea of cyclical learning, especially when it comes to the future of work, you think about somebody who maybe they're still, especially honestly considering what you said about the rate at which there's dropout, if we're focusing on the continent of Africa, you take those that are maybe coming out of secondary school, the 60%, if you will, that are now out because 30% you said drop out by the end of primary, another 30% midway through secondary, and some don't even make it, beyond that. So by the time you get out of secondary school, you said there's 10%, right, of the population that we're talking about that's actually left. So if we were able to create a model around that secondary school time period where those that might not be able to afford it, there's a way of being able to now create that opportunity for them to get a particular skill, to then go into a particular job. And then in a few years' time, depending on the nature of that work or that job, they now go back into the education system, they get reskilled, they get that shadowing, and that cycle continues. So that, I think, really is something interesting that could work, especially in the context of Africa, if you will, with the rate at which there are dropouts in the secondary school education system. So super, super interesting. Let's see. So the next question that I really wanted to ask is maybe more specifically around the types of skills. So we've talked about the macro view, right, about this. We've talked a little bit about how you see the future of work. We've now talked about ways in which we could shake up the system a little bit. But when it comes to the specific skills that you think may be valuable or important, especially given some of the dynamics at play that you mentioned around manufacturing versus services, are there particular skills of interest or competencies that you see that would become more prevalent, particularly when it comes to Africa?
Yeah, well, I think that generally we've kind of gone from a world where you could, and this is perhaps why the education system is built this way, where you could learn a particular skill, whether that's finance or whether that's plumbing.
Yes.
And you could be good with that skill for the next 20, 30 years. And we've kind of come to a world where that isn't necessarily the case, and especially in certain areas. Certain parts of our economy, and I do think that there's more of these in Africa, will be less affected. And I do think that's oftentimes the physical types of jobs that are non-repetitive. Plumbing, electrician, certain types of construction. I think some of those skills will be a bit durable, will kind of last for a while. But in other areas, especially in the kind of knowledge economy, the services, certain parts of the services, we've come to a world where, the skills that you currently have are now kind of like the lifetime or the half-life of them is, 3 years, 5 years, 2 years. And so we've come to a world where you need to constantly be learning.
Yeah.
And so it's not that hard skills are not important, but it's that they're constantly shifting.
Yes.
And so you have to kind of continually upskill yourself, learn new things. And so I think that in and of itself is in some ways a skill. But that then kind of brings us to soft skills, which I think are just these like more enduring type of skills. And, when you were talking about your vision for secondary school,
yes,
you named a bunch of them.
Yes.
And so I actually think about these in kind of 3 different categories. The first one is kind of general problem solving. Okay. And so this is, it's creativity, it's solving a problem or making decisions when you don't have enough data in front of you. It's just kind of dealing with ambiguity. So these types of skills, just like being able to assess a situation, right, and make a plan for it. That's number one. Number two, I think you actually totally said this one, which is managing yourself. Yeah. So this is it's around emotional management. It's around grit. It's around perseverance. So those are some of the skills. Definitely. And then the last one is working with others. So this is around communication. This is around influence. This is around finding win-wins in situations. And so those are kind of the 3 buckets that I see it in. And then, of course, the other one that just always is there, but will kind of underpin a lot of this is just general like digital literacy. Definitely. But again, that switches, that changes, but it's a good thing. But those soft skills are the ones that will endure. And if you kind of can build those up, they'll aid you in this kind of constantly changing hard skill changes to help you kind of navigate that, help you to come up to speed quickly. And be able to implement. So amazing. Those are the ones that I think of.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And I mean, I'm on 2 sides with this because I wonder sometimes about the current generation, and it's anecdotal, but I sometimes wonder if we are doing enough to help them build these kinds of skills. But on the other hand, I hear interesting things about, bringing in therapy into classrooms where you've got younger people, where they do exercises around managing yourself and talking out loud about your feelings and things like that. So I'm hopeful for the generation coming behind us, but I still have questions on whether or not they'll make it. But let's see. So I think that, if we continue kind of building on these layers, we've just talked a little bit about the skills and capability or competencies that young people coming up will need in order to be resilient when it comes to the rapid pace of change with regards to the future of work. How do you see funding? So how do you see governments being able to, incorporate these changes or make these types of changes. Have you read or come across anything interesting? I know that you're based in Kenya, as you've mentioned, and you have been for a while. So maybe you can contextualize it within the Kenyan market or other markets that you've seen. But how do we get, governments to pay for making these kinds of changes? Or is it public-private partnerships? How do we get these kinds of changes financed?
So I think we can talk about that, but I think there's a step before it,
okay,
which is, for kind of for innovation, for new changes, we need for there to be a pull. We need for that innovation, that new thing to be wanted.
Yes.
And to be honest, I think education is one of these areas where it's difficult to make change, and there's various reasons for that.
Okay.
But to be honest, I think one of the biggest ones is mindset.
Okay.
And it's just it's teachers, but it's also, I think actually a lot of it is parents. Parents, and this makes sense. You see this all over the world. This is not just an Africa thing.
Right.
Parents say, listen, I went through this education system.
Right.
This is how it worked.
Yes.
I did this, and especially the ones with the influence,
right,
the parents with influence will say, it worked for me.
Right.
This is what I want for my kid.
Yes.
It worked for me. Why wouldn't it work for them? So actually, oftentimes, I think that when you see, innovations or changes, you'll actually see parents pushing back on it. And it makes sense. It makes sense. Do you want to experiment on my kid? I don't know. Why don't you experiment on someone else's kid and then come back?
Right.
So I think there's a mindset thing there. I think, I also think with teachers also said, how do I teach? Well, I teach how I was taught. So I think that's a big one. And, I think it's a very hard one to solve. But I think that, I think that it starts with, it does start with training of teachers.
Right.
It starts with, I also think that, pushing this into the mainstream right from the beginning, I think can be quite tough. So it's oftentimes I think the way I think about it, and, I'm curious if you've seen it happen in different ways, is oftentimes these things start on the fringe. They start, whether that's a unique school that's decided to implement this, whether that's, a supplement to education. So my kid's going through the traditional education system, but they need to be supplemented in this one area.
Right.
And so they'll do this, and it seems to be working. And then you kind of build up the success story, you build the pie, and you change the mindsets. And then from there, it kind of goes on. So I think that's the first thing. To be honest, I think that the funding is not necessarily the challenge. I think if there was a big pull,
yes.
I think if there was a big pull, I think if parents are saying, we want this is what we need to do.
Right.
I think if teachers are saying, this is how it has to be.
Right.
I think there would be funding. I think there would be funding for these things.
That's fair.
So yeah, I know you work with a lot of startups, you work with investors. It's the same thing. It's about building the market rather than, in the investment space as well, you kind of think about this. The capital is actually not the scarce thing. It's the business, and it's,
Definitely.
Finding the market fit. And once somebody's found the market fit and, things are working, things are flowing, capital comes.
That's a fair point. I mean, I'm recalling the book, The Prosperity Paradox, where they use several examples, actually. One of them, I believe, is Indomie, and the idea that in order for them to be able to distribute their products, they noticed several challenges on roads and issues getting their product distributed. So they went ahead and did the paving of the roads and then worked with the government to find a way to get payments back for what they did. And they came up with clever ways, but essentially there was so much business and revenue and therefore tax dollars that were able to be generated that the third level of roads that needed to be paved or fixed or what have you, governments then stepped in and said, oh, well, maybe we should now start. But if they had started with saying, we can't distribute our product, you need to go fix the roads, it might not have worked out in the way that the success story has become of Indomie and the parent brand, if you will, behind it. So I think I get your point there.
I love that. And and I haven't actually told too much of my story. I'll give one anecdotal piece of this. And this is the other side where there isn't really the pull, but it's the push. This is, somebody has an idea, I'm going to go and put it out there. So I'm originally from the United States. Yes. I came to the African continent, to Zambia, initially in the Peace Corps, I don't know, many years ago. Yeah. And I was in education, working with schools. And I would go to this secondary school that was, I was based in a rural area. I would go to the secondary school. I was friends with a number of the teachers, hang out there, see how I could help out. And for months, they had a little teacher's room in there where the teachers would hang out, spend time when they weren't teaching. And I'd always see this, there's a desk, and then there's this blanket, and there was something under this blanket. And I never really thought too much about it.
Right.
And literally months went by, never, had no idea. And then eventually I was just like, what is under this thing?
Yeah.
And so someone goes like, it pulls it up. It's a computer. I was like, what? You have a computer here?
Yeah.
I had no idea. And I was like, why doesn't anyone, covered by a blanket, why doesn't anyone use this? They said, we don't really, somebody came and they donated it. They gave us a 1-day training, but number one, we don't really know how to use it. Yeah. Number two, like what will we use it for? Wow. And so, you can put the products there, but unless you kind of really aligned with that purpose, understand, have people understand and really want it, the device is just a thing.
Definitely. That's fair. And I think that really hits home on the point that, and honestly ties into the next question about the types of solutions need to be created with the end user in mind. So customer-centric solutions. There will be ways to pay for them if the need is proved out, if the model is proved out. And then your point with this last example is it's not if you build it, they will come, right? It needs to center the actual challenge or the problem. So there wasn't a problem identified for that school or that classroom that computer was going to then solve. Because if there were, they would have been using that computer, they would have been using that laptop. But I think that actually goes into the next question, which is around, we have several ed tech, companies in our portfolio. There are a lot of companies now talking about kind of that cycle through model that you've described. How do you assess current skills of a person? How do you assess their capabilities? How do you identify existing jobs on the market or future jobs? And then how do you help scale them up so that they can now fulfill those jobs? I'm just curious on two things. One, should we be thinking about jobs or continue to be thinking about jobs in the traditional way that we've been thinking about them? Should we be thinking more about work and outcomes? Is AI going to be doing everything? So just maybe helping us think through that a little bit when it comes to this idea of skills, closing the gaps, future of work. How should we be thinking about this?
Yeah, great question. And this is where we start to get into these larger, almost philosophical questions.
Yeah.
The way I think about it is, why do we talk about jobs? Why do we talk about work? It's not really because we want everybody sitting behind a computer,
right?
Or it's not because we want everybody working outside in a farm. It's because the way I think about it is it's about livelihoods.
Yeah, it's
about livelihoods. And there's a really interesting interview with Trevor Noah, actually.
Yes.
Who, I don't know if you've heard it.
3 times.
He talks about, it's a great interview.
Yeah.
Really surprised. I didn't know he was so insightful about these issues. But of course he is. He's insightful about everything.
Right.
He talks about, really the reason that we worry about jobs is because we link jobs with livelihoods.
Yeah.
And that, that's what we do. He talks about, if you look at across the world and anxiety about AI, anxiety about AI is around jobs, but again, it's not about jobs.
Right.
It's not about worrying about people sitting behind computers. It's about if people don't have jobs, then they don't have a livelihood.
Right.
If you look at the different countries around the world, the countries that kind of have stronger support systems, And you think about kind of the Nordic countries that have these strong kind of like social systems that would support people that don't have jobs. There's much less anxiety around artificial intelligence because they don't worry that if it takes my job,
right,
I won't have a livelihood. I will be okay. And I don't know, I can't remember if it was because of this, but at some point I was looking up and I found a map that looked at, asked people the question, how anxious are you about AI? Are you positive about it?
Right.
Are you negative about it? Where are you? And overwhelmingly, I didn't know this, overwhelmingly, Africa was the most negative about AI.
Really?
And if you put these two things together, it makes sense.
Yeah,
people don't feel like if they don't have a job, what's going to happen to them?
Exactly.
The government systems are not that strong. The nice thing that oftentimes we do find in Africa is that there's big community.
Yes. People
will take care of each other, so that is great.
Right.
But overwhelmingly, people are negative about jobs in Africa. So that's kind of like that's why I think about livelihoods as the big thing. So then, what do we do about that? In the current system we're in, which is hard to change.
Yes.
Jobs still do equal livelihoods. And so jobs are important today. But hopefully, what we can start doing is looking beyond that connection of jobs equal livelihoods. So, and how do we do that? It's not an easy question by any means.
Right.
But, I think, again, if there is a need to change, because actually I think that things like AI will exacerbate this. The more, technology tends to centralize things, right? As an example, our social networks were fragmented. They were in the world,
yes.
and now they sit on 2 or 3 or 4 platforms.
Exactly.
So they've been centralized. AI, I think, will also be somewhat of a centralizing type of thing. So you have more and more people using the same AI, and of course we will have different versions of this AI, but I think there will be a few companies that are producing and creating this AI, and they will become extremely wealthy.
Yes.
There will be a lot of wealth created, yes. And I think so. Therefore, you'll continue to see wealth concentrated in a few individuals. So we need to, and if we think that there are some people that will be negatively impacted from AI, we need to think about what it means to have systems that support those people.
Exactly.
So there's various things that we could look at. I just think we kind of need to start experimenting, and there are people doing this. But a few things like we could think about, how do we think about joint ownership of artificial intelligence or artificial intelligence as a public good? I do dabble in the kind of crypto space. You can almost look at the kind of the idea of DAOs or decentralized autonomous organizations, of this like decentralized ownership of these types of things as a potential model. Experimenting with things like universal basic income or different versions of that, I think are just important for us to be doing. And I think that I actually think that this is a very African thing to do. Again, not to overgeneralize, but just the idea of coming together as a community, making decisions as a community, joint ownership of our community and where it goes, taking care of people. To me, that feels very aligned to various African traditions and societal structures.
Exactly. So there's a lot of good points there. I was taking a couple of notes just to see if we can come back to those. But one, to just for anybody who didn't catch the podcast, we'll add that in the show notes. But it's Trevor Noah on the future of entertainment and AI on the podcast called Possible. I believe that's the one that you were referring to. And he made some really interesting points around. And I appreciate that you said it's a little bit more of a philosophical question, because I think one of the points he made was, why do we work, right? So why is there work in the first place? And this idea of a 5-day work week was only because you couldn't have people working 7 days a week because there were more issues with people working at manufacturing facilities, and child labor laws hadn't been introduced and these kinds of things. And so we then had a 5-day work week, but it's because somebody made it up. Right? It's a made up thing. It isn't because we have to work. So I think that your point stands, that there is a philosophical question around work, and it is connected to livelihood. How do we sustain? How do we afford and pay for the things that we need to in order to do the things that we want to on a daily basis, or to survive on a daily basis? And so thinking about that fundamental question is important. And then the other point that you're bringing up, just some of these examples, I really like the one around the joint ownership of AI. I mean, I think about it myself sometimes. If there were ways to leverage kind of blockchain technology, leverage DAOs, but leverage a way where if my data is being used in an LLM, can we track and trace that and you get paid for every time your data is being used? Are there ways in which we could create systems that allow people to get paid for access to our data? Because you're right, the more and more that these large language models get created, these AI models get created, a lot of our data gets used for these. But the bigger point is the centralization of the resources, the centralization of the wealth, who's actually making money off of this. And that's a problem, right? That's a challenge. So let's maybe talk a little bit, right, about, so I really like those solutions that you described, but let's talk a little bit about the rural communities. So I appreciate that you've also brought that up in different points of our conversation, but as we talk about the future of work where in a lot of rural communities, there's less access to internet, there's potentially lower quality materials in schools, less incentive, right, for startups to go into rural communities per se, because margins usually are lower, price points are lower. So it's a bit of a conundrum, if you will, to have rural expansion for many of the types of startups, not every, but many of them. Do you agree with that premise? And if so, how do we incentivize startups from your point of view to do more, right, in rural communities? And have you seen anything interesting as it relates to the future of work or the edtech space that you're excited about?
Yeah, good question. Yeah. Yeah. So rural communities are present their own challenges. Yeah. I think, again, so let's talk about demographics real quick.
Yeah.
First of all, a large percentage of our populations are working in agriculture. Mm-hmm. I recently found out, at least here in Kenya, that when you look at the youth population,
yes,
actually there are more young people working in services than in agriculture, which surprised me. Mm-hmm. And services continue to grow while agriculture actually, among youth, but actually among the full population, is declining.
Okay.
Now, it's not declining quickly. It's not something that this is not going to be there for a long time, but I think it will be a little bit less and less of the economy as time goes on. And as agriculture gets more mechanized, as we kind of get larger and larger farms, you're going to see less and less people working in there. So even in the rural areas, you see a lot of migration. You see a lot of migration to cities, and you see a lot of people kind of going in that space. Mm-hmm. So that's just kind of recognizing, like, where are young people in rural places going? Some of them are going to agriculture, but a lot of them are still going into services and going elsewhere. I think that again, the second part of this is, what are we looking to do in rural areas? And I go back to the same thing. What is the pull? Yeah. Or Clayton Christensen, who does a lot of work on innovation, yes, would say, what is the work to be done? What are those young people and what are these teachers trying to do? Because we need to help them do that work, yes, rather than just kind of go out there and say, this is what we've brought to you.
Right.
And so we need to, that's the first thing. Let's just make sure that we're aligned to that. And then the second thing is, so I think there's digital solutions. I think there's non-digital solutions. The second thing is, how do we assuming we found this alignment, mm-hmm, assuming we've aligned ourselves to kind of the work to be done, what they want to do. It's how do we get out there? How do we distribute? Yeah, exactly. And I think one of the greatest things about digital solutions is that they don't have to necessarily be fully rural focused. They can be, mm-hmm, but somebody can be using ChatGPT here in Nairobi, just as somebody can be using ChatGPT in rural Marsabit. So the same solutions can go to several places. Just what digital does. So that's great. But I think in terms of, if we want to now really customize things for these areas where there is typically less of an ability to pay for it, you need kind of a third-party payer to come in and join. And I think that there's various ways of doing this. Often, working with companies that have interests out there is obviously one of the biggest ways. And I think that is a great pathway to jobs as well. So these will oftentimes be more agriculture type of focused companies. But what is the work that they want to do out there? How do we then partner with somebody to make sure that we are empowering these young people in education to be ready for this job if they choose it? So that's this is not something that will shock most people, but that is like a big avenue to it. And then yes, there are like a lot of foundations, organizations that have interest in doing this type of thing.
Right.
I think more and more what I've seen is that more and more people are really trying to link this with work. I think that they're trying to say, just kind of educating people just for skills is not enough. How do we educate people for skills, but with a very specific work outcome
1,000%
in mind?
Exactly.
So, map that. I guess it's map, where are we trying to get people? What is the end state that we're trying to get people in? This is before we have delinked, livelihoods and work. We're still in this place where these are linked. So what is that work that we're going to try and get them into? And then how do we work backwards from there and really prepare them for that? And I think that, then it's just kind of finding the funding for that.
Definitely. I would say the next thing that comes to mind as you talk about opportunities for the rural communities that aren't necessarily close to the cities, maybe is around the population dynamics as well. So I'm curious on your thought where there's the stat that goes around about the average age of the young person in Africa is 25 and it's only getting younger. By 2050, it's going to be 19. Whereas in the rest of the world, across Europe, across the US, across parts of Asia like China and Japan, it is significantly lower. The average age of the demographic is, significantly older, if you will, significantly younger on the continent, significantly younger in India and even parts of Latin America. But my question is really around, do you see these trends coming together, especially when it comes to the future of work? So said differently, you have the rest of the world getting older, you have the continent getting younger. There's so much opportunity when it comes to the future of work, as we've talked about today, where there is an opportunity for people across the continent to get plugged into the global economy, right? Digitally, working on the internet. So do you see where those kind of trends collide at all when it comes to the future of work? And if so, what are your thoughts around how that collision looks? I have some ideas and thoughts around healthcare, but just curious on your point of view there.
I think that it can be a great thing, and I also think it can be a worrying thing. And it could go, as much as I love to think about the future, there's a lot that we still don't know about it. And so it can go various ways. With this continually growing young population, there's going to be, we want them to find jobs. We want them because that is livelihoods.
Exactly.
At this point, we have about, 3 times the amount of young people graduating from or entering the workforce, let me say, than the number of jobs that are created on the continent each year. So that's difficult. That's a hard environment to be thrown into. And so I think that yes, what you're alluding to is, can young Africans seize those opportunities that are not within the continent? And that could be through migration. Healthcare is a perfect example. You talked about that. There's a shortage of nurses around the world. The Philippines has been a huge place where nurses have been trained, and but there's still a shortage. Can we take advantage of that? I think we absolutely can. I think that is a great thing, and I think that we should do that. I don't personally look at this idea of the brain drain as a problem. I know that that's kind of a thing a phrase that gets thrown out. I see it as people that leave still contribute, are invested in their countries, whether that's sending money home, whether that's doing projects back home, or they cycle back. People oftentimes will move back. So I don't see that as a problem. I think it's a great thing. Then there's the digital side of things. And, can people remain on the African continent and then get those opportunities abroad? I think definitely that is a huge thing as well. India has the lead in this, and there is a bit of a competition. But, there's still opportunities that can be taking place. And the thing about this is that it's so, as I talked about before, it moves so quickly. In the digital space, again, I think that what somebody's doing today may not be applicable in a couple of years. Exactly. As an example, in Kenya, can you guess what the biggest online service that was provided by freelancers was by young people in Kenya? Any guess, any idea?
Something in the creative.
That's what I would have thought too. I thought so too, actually, when I first heard this. It's ghostwriting, and it's academic ghostwriting. So it's actually this is crazy. Young people in Africa are writing people in the West their PhD theses or dissertations, which tells you a lot about some of the skills.
It does.
But actually what we found is that since the release of ChatGPT, the demand for that has gone way down. So again, there's a lot of adaptability that needs to happen there. It's going to change.
Yes.
So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. My worry is that if this doesn't happen, we continue to have more and more people enter the workforce that cannot find work.
Right.
And then you have the headwinds of automation.
Exactly.
In the digital space, some things will definitely be automated. And it's hard to really predict exactly what will and what won't be automated.
Right.
Like data labeling. I've had debates with people both ways. Data labeling. You have images, videos, and you need people to tag them. And this can be just for the listener in case this doesn't make sense. You need them to tag them, and this actually helps to train AI. This is one of the things that helps train AI. There's other uses for it as well. But as I talk to people, the question is this going to be something in 3 to 5 years? And I get people that are working in the space that are on both sides of the debate. Some people say this, in 3 years, everything will be, it'll be automatically tagged. Other people say, no, we'll continually need people to supervise this or to do it themselves. So I don't know. Where that goes. And so it's going to be constantly like hustle, change, do something different.
Back to your cyclical model of training, right? Like to your point.
And this can be an opportunity for Africa because there's other places that are kind of have the advantage. But if we can catch up or overtake, that could be great as well.
Yes.
So, but if we don't, if automation takes place and we don't get, these jobs, I think that could be a worry. Now, last thing, to step back from all of that, that's also a very kind of like fixed mindset, the pie is only so big, we're all in competition type of mindset. Right. And I'd like to be optimistic and say, are there ways where we're not in competition? Are there ways where, we're able to kind of like use all these abundant technologies that are coming online, AI being one of them, but there are other ones as well, robotics, where we're really just able to kind of raise all ships. And again, I think this probably goes to a point where, we're starting to delink jobs from well-being. Yes. And everyone, is able to kind of rise at the same time. I would love that. And that's what I'm hopeful for.
Exactly. I mean, there's a few thoughts that come to mind based on what you just described. So in answering the question, it's yes, on the one hand, brain drain on the surface seems like an issue, but there aren't enough jobs anyway for people who are being trained. If we just play out kind of from the earlier part of the conversation where we talk about the people who don't end up going through the formal education system, so you end up with 10% of a workforce that's even available, right? Maybe a little bit more than that. So then you take that population and now they are educated and looking for a job. And there isn't even enough work to actually employ those that do make it through the education system, if you will, if I'm making that connection correctly. So then the opportunity exists, in other countries, but as automation increases, those jobs may start to decrease in other parts of the world as well. So then what is left for Africa? But the question that comes to my mind is, but there's so much development required on the continent. right? So how do we now help to create the jobs that, to your, again, one of your earlier points, may not get taken, by automation that still need to be done? How do we close that gap there, if you will? So yeah, I'm with you. Okay. So last question. Great conversation. Very much appreciate all of your insights. And I think that this will be very beneficial for folks listening in. But 500 years from now, Matthew, we've invested in the future, right? We may be alive. I don't know if depending on how fast technology moves between now.
Longevity, all of these things. Yeah. Yeah.
So what's one aspect of society that you hope will change? How can we influence changing it? And what should we be investing in today as a result?
Yeah. Well, I think I'm going to give you an answer that I've stated a few times already, which I really hope that we de-link the idea of work and livelihoods. Okay. And what does this mean? What does this mean? It doesn't mean that we're all sitting around. I think there's what was the show? WALL-E. Yes. WALL-E, yeah. the old movie where everyone's kind of sitting around, they're all obese and just kind of do nothing and have no purpose.
Yeah.
I don't think that's where we go. I think, humans love to do things. If we're sitting idle, people find projects, they find things that they do, and they have passions.
Yes.
And would be, what I would love to see is where everybody has the opportunity to follow a passion, find something that's very meaningful for them, be able to follow that. Yes. And that becomes their meaning. And people are not forced into work that they don't necessarily care about or wouldn't do if it wasn't because of the need for a livelihood or the need for salaries, need for finances, need for safety nets.
Exactly.
So that's what I would love to see. And I just think that humans would flourish. I really do. I think that we would see all sorts of interesting things, new art, new philosophy, just all sorts of pursuits. And I think that people would actually feel very fulfilled. I do. I know because I say that, I emphasize that because I know there's kind of another school of thought that thinks that, if we don't have this purpose or this like striving for something, that we wouldn't feel
meaningful,
particularly
impact.
Significant. But I think that we would. I think I'm hopeful that we would, and I think that would be, a great place where we just didn't have the suffering and the need for all of these things. I think you also asked how do we do that? Well, we haven't got into like the deep, like how do we pursue AI and like make it happen? Because I think that is one of the big drivers of all of this. But I do think that we need to really invest, on the continent. I think we need to invest in AI. I think there's a skills component to it, which is really, really important.
Definitely.
How do we have people develop skills? And that's a range of skills. That's like the hardcore research skills, PhDs. Definitely. That is the, kind of just the average person on the street. Do you know how to use this? How can this benefit your life? Are you aware that this exists? So that's one. Number two, we need to invest in the data. So for solutions to work for Africa, like right now, there's a big, idea that like AI doesn't work for Africa. It doesn't understand the societies. It doesn't understand like picture. It's trying to make a picture of somebody, or it doesn't recognize somebody with darker skin. And those are problems. They are, but I think that they're not I think they're not problems that can't be overcome.
Exactly.
We need AI to understand the languages across the continent. Africa has tons of languages, and I think that it can, and I think that can be a blessing. I think it can be amazing. I think we're also entering a time where people don't necessarily have to be forced to leave their family's language behind and are forced to speak English or French or Arabic. They can speak the language and still interact through these tools. So we need to have the data in order to do that, though. Yes. And so I think there's an investment into data and African data sets, open African data sets that needs to be there. So I think that's a big one. And then, we just need to experiment and try different incentive models. One thing I like to say is that because AI is always a debate, people have different reactions to it. But my thoughts on this is AI is coming.
Yeah.
So these ideas, It's here, and it will continue to come. I mean, if you look at the progress in the last year, it's insane. And that's going to continue, in my opinion.
Right.
So this idea of like, oh, should we stop AI? Should we, slow it down? I don't see that as really a possibility. Or maybe if I'm just, maybe it is a possibility, but if I look at the African continent, that decision is not going to be made here.
Right.
I don't think.
Right.
So therefore, we need to say, great, it's coming. Mm-hmm. Let's make sure we're ready for it. Let's make sure we get the benefits of it. Yes, let's look at the risks. We can mitigate those, but let's make sure that we're ready. Let's not turn our heads, run away from it. Let's lean into it and figure out how we make it work.
Yeah, that's exciting. I mean, a couple of things. I think we're running an accelerator program. The number of applications we've seen that have some component of AI is definitely encouraging. NVIDIA Startup Alliance, they have a whole focus on the Middle East, Turkey, and Africa, and there's tons of startups that they're supporting. So to your point, I'm excited about that. I do think that the research component, where you have more funding, more grants going into research that's specifically targeted to learning more about the continent and getting data sources from the continent is important. And I'm not sure that we have made enough progress there. But I think that a really great point to end on is what you mentioned around getting ourselves to a place where human beings are allowed to flourish, right? Reach their greatest potential without having to, be in poverty or to worry about where their next meal is going to come from, and just to think about what kind of society we could create from there as a result is something I think and a beautiful way to end on, because I think that is the goal. And I'm not sure we talk enough about the vision of where we're trying to get to with all of the great advancements in technology, but I would have to say that that's it. And it's something that I think about as well, is if society was kind of taken care of and livelihood was taken care of and you knew where meals were going to come from and you didn't have to worry, what would society look like? You could take care of yourself. You could work out. You could be in community with people, right? Like you could do the things that you need and create. And what kind of world would we have as a result? So that's a perfect way to end. Matt, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I hope the listeners get lots of great insights and nuggets from this session, and we'll see you on the next episode. Thank you. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Invest in the Future. You can follow us on all our social media platforms @An African Future to get more insights into the African tech ecosystem.